Welcome to RMB Africa Focus, a dedicated series that will focus on Africa's economic resilience and strategic role in global economies. Over the coming weeks, we will also explore how the African continent can sustain momentum, leverage opportunities, and remain competitive in these very uncertain times. We will also highlight the significance of Africa's economy and its resilience in the face of economic challenges. This week, I'm in conversation with RMB's Chief Economist, Isaah Mhlanga. Isaah, let's start with setting the scene. Why is trade and investment so important for Africa at this very particular moment in a very uncertain world?
It's very important if you look at what are the needs of the continent in terms of development. We have huge needs for infrastructure, and that is it's quite wide. It's social infrastructure that have to do with schooling, water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, roads. We still have a need of that. So there is a definite need for infrastructure across the continent. But then who has to do the investing? It's the large pension funds, large institutional investors, that will be asset managers, that have patient capital. And by that we mean institutions that have the ability to wait a little longer before they get their return on investments. So that would be your pension funds, your large asset managers. The banking sector, by and large, they lend very short term. So let's say short to medium term, 3 to 7 years. Beyond that, you need the patient capital. So those are the investors that would look at these projects that typically are inflation-linked, which means they protect the capital against inflation, and therefore it works well for the portfolios of these institutional investors. But the development need of the continent itself is the one that informs the need for investment, in particular in infrastructure.
Isaah, so you talked about and outlined the critical need for infrastructure and investment. Now we have the Africa Free Trade Pact. It's been around, operationalized since 2021. But what can you, in your view, working on the continent, what needs to happen for us to see this in action?
So first, just to contextualize how much trade African countries do with each other. It's only 15% intra-Africa trade. If you look at Europe, the US, Latin America and North America, it's north of 40% at a minimum, which means Africa does not trade with each other as easily as other continents do. So that means you still have an opportunity to increase our intra-Africa trade, which means economies can grow quicker. But what is required for that to happen? So first, people have to move first before goods and services can move. Because ultimately, investment decisions are made by people. If people cannot move to a different country to assess on the ground potential, it becomes difficult for them to make investment decisions behind the desktop. So the ability of people to move around is a prerequisite for the ability of capital to cross borders. Which is why if you look at the European Union, you can move from one European country to the next quite easily without having to stop, without having to need a visa. Again, much similar, the North Atlantic trade area, you can move much easier without the need of visa. And if you look at trade flows in those regions that enable people to move, they're much, much higher. So we need the people-to-people movement first. And then the second one would be the logistics. It's easier for me to fly to London or to fly to France than it is for me to fly to Ghana, which means the ability of people to fly from one place to the next is a necessary condition for the Africa Free Continental Trade area to work. And then road infrastructure, rail infrastructure, one-stop border posts where you don't have to stop at each and every border post, which then reduces how expensive it is to move around. So it's those logistical infrastructures that need to be there before we can actually even dream of having the ability to implement this. And the criticality of the rail infrastructure can never be underestimated. It's quite critical given that most African countries, they export commodities. Think about copper in Zambia. Think about cobalt in the DRC. All of those things needs to move across rail. And if we don't have the same rail gauges in different countries where a train can move from one country to the next without having to redesign new railway lines, then it becomes easier for us to transport these bulk goods to ports, which we have in Durban, we have some in East Africa, and then we have some in Angola. We have to integrate all those systems to make it easier to transport these bulk goods. So infrastructure is a precondition.
As I used to say, 15%, that's kind of the trade. It's very little. So it means there's a lot of room for expansion and opportunity if we deal, as you say, with infrastructure.
Absolutely.
And the ports, for instance. And so given that you've outlined that, what still are some of the key sectors, in your view, that is ultimately still driving investment in Africa?
You just have to look at what does Africa require? What sort of natural endowments does the continent have? One is minerals across most African countries, which means mining still remain one of those sectors that continues to attract investment, and it will continue to do so for the foreseeable future. We're talking of critical minerals globally that are required in the decarbonization of the global economy. And most of those minerals are found in many African countries. So they will continue to attract this investment. And the second one will be education. Skills levels still remain quite low relative to other continents. And until you solve the skills gap, you're not going to be able to develop. It's skills that enable people to lift out of poverty. So you need educational infrastructure. Perhaps not in the same ways in terms of bricks and mortar, but technologically enabled infrastructure that enables a kid in Malawi to access content that has been developed in South Africa, for instance. So that investment in education is quite important. Colloquially, we can call it edtech. And then there is healthcare. We're still burdened with disease, and the ability of people to access medical services is still quite limited. In some instances, even our leaders across the continent, they fly out of the continent to get medical attention. So we need health tech as well. That's a big area of investment. And then the other obvious one is we have nearly 8 billion people in the world that needs to be fed. 30% of arable land sits in Africa, which means there's a huge opportunity to feed the rest of the world, but also to create the jobs in the low-skill sector, which is agriculture. So those are the most obvious. And you can talk about digital technology, financial inclusion, given that our levels of financial penetration is still quite low. Much of the region is still quite rural and not urban, which means you need digital infrastructure for people to access financial products that then improves their lives overall. So we can talk about many others, but I think those are the key ones that I think still attracts investment, and there are potential returns that investors can get out of.
Isaah, so let's change focus a bit. The Pan-African payment and settlement system is, of course, a cross-border financial market infrastructure that is enabling payments across Africa. Talk to us about this and how has it changed the scene, so to say, in Africa?
We can locate this in a global context where the predominant payment system is SWIFT, which is controlled by the rich countries, the US being one of them. They have also at times weaponized this access to this payment system, where if a country is deemed to be doing something that is not in the right space, they can simply just exclude that country from that payment system. Russia was one example. which means there has been a recognition that having only one payment system that a country can access is risky. So what you're seeing is a development of alternative payment systems that countries will access in the event they can't access the existing payment systems. So that's a de-risking. But you also have countries that are close together that do trade quite frequently. Why should they use a payment system that is too far away, whose technology is maintained and developed too far away, and they have no control of it? So the Pan-African one would make sense. It's countries that has the ability to increase their trade close together, controlled by their own government. So it makes a lot of sense. Where we trade with, for instance, Botswana, South Africa sells vegetables to Botswana. Why should we, use a different currency instead of just using our own? So that payment system between the two countries can facilitate that trade. So that should reduce the cost of doing business, but also reduce the risks that lie with having access to only one payment system. It's long time coming. It's still going to take some time to have a stronger integration between African countries. But the efforts that have been done so far, I think there have been a lot of progress.
Isaah, so talk to us about, you mentioned infrastructure, you mentioned ports, but we do see that there's the emergence of logistics and trade corridors. And here we're talking, for instance, already there's been a big focus on the Lobito Corridor. And some say it's likely to be a game changer. What's your view about this and other potential corridors across Africa?
So this fits into the infrastructure need of the continent, but also in the Africa Free-Colonial Trade area. You say we need countries that are interlinked by rail, by road, such that it's easier to move from Cape Town up to Cairo with interconnecting different types of transport modes. And that is where the Lobito Corridor comes in, from Zambia to DRC and then to Angola. But we can also link Zambia through Zimbabwe to South Africa through rail, which means you will have the ability to either choose to take the copper out of Zambia via Angola, or you take the copper via Durban, or the copper via Maputo. All of these countries have ports. So the choices of ports then becomes less of a hindrance if you have access to various transport corridors. It simplifies the transportation of these bulk goods that most of the continent do export. So it's quite critical. It's a game changer because it links several countries that in themselves have large populations. It's not just about goods transportation, but it's also about people movement. Much of Europe uses trains, not buses. And it's cheap, it's much more safe, less to insure because you don't get as many trains derailing as you get cars in accidents. So that cost of accidents gets reduced significantly. So it actually has economic benefits, which means it's likely to be a big game changer for the countries through which these railways travel through.
And then just lastly, Isaah, of course, South Africa, as the G20 presidency, President Cyril Ramaphosa has made it very clear it's not only South Africa's presidency, but also Africa. Your sense of how things are at and how can we actually leverage the G20 presidency?
So far, the discussions have been, I think, have been positive. The themes, people, planet, and equality, I think it's quite opportune. One of the issues that we've had with the G20 setup is Africa was not represented. So that's 1.4 billion people in Africa, minus the 60 million South Africans, given South Africa's membership of the G20, whose views and aspirations were not at the forefront of the global agenda. So now Africa is part of the G20, represented through the African Union, which means you now have African issues that are placed in the global agenda. So that's a win in itself. And advocating for development in general, the whole continent requires development. The cost of financing, Africa is on the receiving end, given that we pay a lot more in debt servicing costs compared to other countries. So it's one of the themes to reduce the cost of financing for critical infrastructure. The other one would be, how do we deal with crisis management? We've learned through COVID, we wanted to access vaccines. The rich countries hoarded their vaccines and we could not access when we needed it. So putting that agenda on the table to say, in times of crisis, we need an equitable access of all the tools that we need to deal with crisis, not at the behest of the rich countries, but on the basis of equality of access to these critical tools that we need to solve our own crisis. And then you can also think about climate change. Africa is the least polluter, only 4% or less in terms of accumulated global pollutions. But if you look in terms of the potential impact, because our economies are less resilient to climate change, but also because we don't have as much capital to invest in climate-resistant infrastructure, it means we get impacted the most. So as a result, to source climate financing from the rest of the world that has so much capital, that has contributed to global emissions to a large extent, makes sense to help African countries improve their resilience to adapt to the changing climate conditions. So those are some of the topics that have been put by South Africa, but they don't just speak to South Africa, they speak for the rest of the continent, which is an opportune time. But I think also just hosting the G20 itself means you are in focus for the rest of the world. You have leaders that will be coming to the country, you have business people that will be coming to the country. They have an opportunity to understand better your country than they would without them coming to experience the country in real life. Which means we do have a role to showcase what we are doing in South Africa, what we are doing as Africans, to try and lift our own economic development, which the rest of the world does not necessarily understand. But because they are here in our shows, we have a better opportunity to demonstrate all of that and be able to attract investment in the continent.
Thank you so much for your insights, Isaah.
Thanks for having me.